The Commodore 64 first came to my attention when I was staring at newspaper listings at home around October 1986. I noticed they were expensive. In those days, I wasn't yet working, save a temporary lawn mowing job, and trying to save every penny to purchase my own Commodore 64 computer. Later, I learned a neighbor owned a Commodore 64. I wanted to see if it was good as the newspaper clippings stated. Finally, he invited me over on November 10, 1986, and I found it was better than I ever dreamed as I saw the Ghostbusters, G.I. Joe games, and other titles. After exploring the amazing graphics, I realized I wanted to own my own system, so I began saving all my loose change, and the journey began. My second encounter with the Commodore 64 occurred on October 24, 1987. My mother was doing some early Christmas shopping then at the mall and directed me to go elsewhere. My path led to the Sears store, and this is where I first discovered the existence of the Commodore 64. It was too cool. Since I was already familiar with programming by that time, I began creating some simple loops. Soon a store manager approached me and advised me that I would have to leave if I stayed on the computer. She actually stated, "The computers are for the customers to see." Ha! Wasn't I a customer too? Time put my patience on hold, and it wasn't until January 28, 1989 when I finally purchased my own Commodore 64C computer and a disk drive at Toys R Us. The computer cost $129. I actually purchased a 1541 drive separate at Children's Palace for $210 since there was a sale. I was fortunate that I already owned a few Commodore 64 games since I had some discs that were double-sided. One side contained Atari home computer games and the other side allowed the Commodore 64 titles to run. The computer also came bundled with GEOS, which resembled the Macintosh operating system in those days. The first thing I noticed in comparison to the Atari computer was how much larger the keyboard was. It contained the same amount of memory of 64K, 64 kilobytes. The basic programming language allowed text colors to display up to 16 colors. The Atari lacked this since it only supported up to 5 colors when you used the antic mode. This computer was different, alright. Some of the cons were that the graphics mode consumed memory more quickly and were often complicated to program. To enhance my understanding of the Commodore 64 basic language, I began to visit the public library to check out some titles. Since the purchase nearly bankrupted me, I cannot afford my own books. However, the library soon filled that void as I was introduced to many amazing books. Some of the earliest titles I checked out were Commodore 64 Color Graphics, 64 Sounding Graphics, How to Build Programs on Your Commodore 64, and All About the Commodore 64. There were some cool game examples I experienced contained within those books. Typing was one of the milestones I had to overcome in those days. Often the programs required a user to enter a bunch of lines sequentially. For the programs to work at 100%, this required no less than perfection. I was only an avid typist and had to train my eyes to proofread my code for any errors. After all, this could be stressful since it required patience and maintain a pattern of scanning the lines from left to right. It was similar to reading, but required closer observation of strange characters and sometimes a mountain of data statements. And so, my experience began. About a month later, I finally bought some other Commodore 64 games after receiving my paycheck. I was working in retail then. I purchased Test Drive and Predator at a total of $41. I was instantly hooked on Test Drive since it was a driving simulation and had outstanding graphics. Predator, to my surprise, had even better graphics, but was often difficult to maneuver the character around. As my eyes absorbed the amazing multicolor of the Commodore 64, I began to dream of maybe one day designing my own game program in machine language. I still had a distance to go since I was still learning about the memory map of the Commodore 64 in those days. Yet I was determined to accomplish this in due time. In those days, my neighbor Nicky would come over to play my Commodore 64 games. He also had possession of another computer called the Tandy Coco computer. I spent a lot of times walking to his house down the street to type in basic programs for him from magazines he checked out at the library. He wasn't thrilled about typing, so I opted to slave away at the keyboard while he rummaged around in his room. Those began the days of sharing my passion with my neighbor and hoping to convince him that programming was the wave of the future. We always waited in anticipation until the program listing was perfect. Then, we could finally reap the rewards of the program we had typed in. I would like to promise you that the Commodore 64 was my favorite computer in those days, but remember, I started it on the Atari Personal System. After spending a lot of time checking out books, researching code in BASIC, the Commodore 64 began to frustrate me for its lack of accessing graphics modes and easily sprite assimilation. I was also distracted since I received a monthly Atari analog magazine and purchased antique magazines in stores. At that time, the Atari home computer was still the supreme fascination in my life and would continue for a little bit at a time. Therefore, I began to offer my Commodore 64 to a friend to trade for his computer. At that time, he had everything I wanted for my Atari, which was another computer called the Atari 800XL, all his programs, books, discs, and a printer. It was a deal of the century, and I finally turned over my Commodore 64C on November 5, 1989. I felt then that the Commodore 64 was old and abandoned in my mind. Therefore, I was also planning on trading the Atari 800XL for Nicky's Coco computer. I was on a quest to grow my knowledge of many extraordinary systems and leave the poor Commodore 64 in the dust. During the absence of my Commodore 64, I began to enhance my knowledge of machine language on the Atari home computer. The book seen here is called Assembly Language Programming for the Atari Computers, was my first journey into learning how to write in assembly language. Much later, I would buy antique magazines and continue to deepen my understanding of how to write in the 6502 language. My other hobbies consisted of roller skating in those years and speed skating backward, very fast. However, many of my nights were won to the admiration of personal computers. It was nearly a year later, November 5, 1990, when my friend called and told me that he would sell the Commodore 64 back to me. At that time, we were already hanging out. I'll have to admit that the wonder of this machine had not yet caught up with me, but somewhere below the surface, I yearned to know more about this machine. Also, I had just finished my first machine language game on the Atari called Deadman. Finally, on November 8, 1990, I purchased my Commodore 64 back from my friend. At that time, however, I learned that he was already working on an IBM PC that he borrowed from a friend. Desktop computers were not affordable in those days. Only much later would I finally gain respect for the Commodore 64 once I realized I couldn't live without it. That would finally reassemble the frustration I had with the machine and humble me to its power. It was during that time I began to work on my very first machine language game for the Commodore 64. It was called Spaced Out, and here's a screenshot. On January 22, 1992, I purchased the next upgrade to the Commodore 64. It was called the Amiga 500. The system was a revolution for its time and was far beyond any computer designed to date. It came equipped with an operating system. It could reproduce speech and phonemes, had mind-blowing graphics, and came included with stereo audio. I also learned Amiga Basic in those years. The Amiga 500 rivaled many competitors in that day, which included the Atari ST. Much later, I purchased a Commodore Run magazine at the City Mall and saw an advertisement for a disc subscription called Lodestar. Around June 1992, I started receiving a monthly disc service from them. Each issue came included with 2 double-density discs packed with utilities, games, programs, and often art. Also, it was imprinted with the editor's insignia. They each wrote their own reviews, opinions regarding the Commodore 64 in that generation. Those were great times, and a lot of fun. So, life would go on, and many years later, YouTube was born. I started this channel on July 20th, 2009. At that time, I was into Dark GDK, Microsoft C++, and Grand Theft Auto 4. Later, my passion with the Atari dominated the channel for the longest time. Eventually, I rekindled my long-lost relationship with the Commodore 64 and have committed to bringing you videos in BASIC and machine language. Long live the Commodore 64 until the end of time. Hello everyone, I want to thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this synopsis into my life exploring the Commodore 64. And yeah, I think it was really interesting to put together, and I've learned a lot of things myself during this time, and just began to kind of look back and just be grateful for the Commodore 64. I had no idea at this time, as I was reading through my journals and everything, that I had one time lost respect for the Commodore 64, and you saw in the video here that I actually ended up selling it and gotten it back about a year later. So it was thanks to my friend who decided to sell it back to me. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this, and please always, as always, like, favorite, subscribe to this channel, and we'll keep the stuff going forward, and looking forward to getting this project going forward, the machine language simulation games, whatever it becomes. And yeah, guys, just have a great night.